Hello everyone. Welcome to a public lecture by Janet Murray. We'll start in a second. So this afternoon is hosted by the focus area Game Research and the new Professorship Interactive Narrative Design at the HKU. And we will also have drinks outside in the nice sunny courtyard. So I'm glad that you're all in here with us, even though it's such nice weather outside. Very briefly, when Janet's, I guess, one of her most famous book, Hamlet on the Holodeck, came out in the late 90s. It was also the period I started studying film studies. And it was one of those texts which actually led me to deviate away from film studies into the area of new media and more specifically games and game studies, showing me, as it has shown a lot of people, that there's more to games than just silly games and silly play, but there's potential in these new forms of digital media for storytelling, for new worlds to explore, and for new narrative worlds to also create. A few years later, I saw a very interesting keynote lecture during the very first international conference here hosted in Utrecht of the Digital Games Research Association, or DIGRA. This keynote lecture by Ms. Murray is actually online if you wanted to revisit that one. And I'm not actually sure if you still have this, but I brought a copy of the very first DIGRA conference. It's right there if you want another copy. But that also, that talk and her work and this book also led to a very interesting founding discussion of the field of game studies, more on which I'll let Hartmut explain.
Well, yeah, thank you, Rene. So also welcome on behalf of HKU, and we're very happy to have this joint event, which also speaks a bit of our increased efforts to work together, HKU and UU, and I think you will see more coming out of that, and I'm very happy to be able to facilitate that. Yeah, I'm honored to have Janet here, and of course Hamlet on the Holodeck also brought me into the field like many others of us, and it's probably now the opportunity to show the new edition, just out last year, with a lot of extra content, with a lot of updates basically. So this is still very much also a current book nowadays through this new edition. Of course, there's also a digital version out there. But what we see also even more just lately in the past couple of weeks, there has been an article that brought the whole thing really back into discussion, an article in The Atlantic by Ian Bogost, who was really not so positive about the idea of the holodeck. Let's put it mildly. So it seems to a certain degree we're back into a discussion, and I think Janet will reference that. I mean, I'm guessing from the title somehow, and I think that with that I should just shut up and sit down and let Janet Murray take the stage.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for coming, and thank you to Rene and to Hartmut for having me here. And I am very gratified to have led you astray, and anyone else here, into this field. I've been rethinking my title and rethinking my stance toward this perennial but dispute. It's sort of a dispute. It's sort of like whack-a-mole, that you think that it's over with and then it pops up again, the dispute between narrative and games. And Ludoparanoia was my first take on why anybody would write an article called Games Are Better Without Stories. But then I decided narrative phobia was more accurate, that it's really more about the fear of narrative. Thank you for showing the covers of my book. Having it come out again 20 years later, I have the opportunity to gloat and to say that I was right about a lot of things. It's interesting that it brought a lot of people into game studies, but also into other forms of digital media expression. And this year I was on 2 panels with Espen Arseth, which took the position that 1997 was the beginning of game studies with the publication of both of our books. But actually, my focus was not, though I took games seriously, as Espen did, so that's why people think of it as an initiating event. I was really focused on narrative. And then I was accused, to my surprise, of having colonialist motives to take over games with narrative. So before I begin, I want to say my focus was on a whole range of computational narrative forms, not just video games. Sorry, I have some kind of allergic reaction, so my voice may get a little squeaky. But I was not. But then I was accused of these other motives toward games. So I want to make clear of the things that I didn't claim. Okay, so I never said that video games had this destiny, like in paradise, as narratives, as holodeck narratives, and I never said that games should aspire to be movies. I agreed with the ludologists that the games don't have to grow up, that they're fine as they are, but to the extent that they're getting better, they don't are necessarily, better doesn't mean more story-like, but that, and I think that the ludology, narratology debate was really interesting in that it allowed for the claiming of turf, rightly, for games as their own subject of study, which I think was completely appropriate. And I think that part of what was directed against me and Henry Jenkins was displaced from a lot of European departments where there actually were narratologists, since we, probably couldn't tell you the difference between the Fablio and the whatever that other thing is, right? So I think that there was a political battle there that was real, but it wasn't really about the difference between games and stories. And where I really strongly disagreed with them is that there was something impure about narrative in games, and that's what's resurfaced lately, although I don't think that there are many people who defended that position. I think one person took that position, but I think a lot of people then wrote against that position. And I don't agree that the rules of the games are real, but the narrative is somehow unreal, because I think that the rules are also representational elements, and that all of those elements speak to culture. And so in the 2003 talk and in an article, I guess I also gave a Digra talk in 2006, and out of that I wrote a piece called The Last Word on Ludology versus Narratology, which is on my blog, which was perhaps wishful thinking. But I was really the last word from my point of view, in that it made clear that something that I think people now widely accept, which is that it's not a fault to speak of games the same way we speak of movies. or of literature. That if there's a representation in a game that has a cultural value, that it's appropriate to have a discourse about the cultural, about that reference. I think that this is where the ludologists and the Gamergate folks sort of align in trying to make a space for games that is completely without cultural reference, and that's where I'm very clearly on the other side of that. One of the ways in which I made that point was to tease Espen, which was really fun, because he was caught. I was teased about Tetris, though I was completely right about Tetris, but and we can discuss that if you want. But then Espen said that when he played Tomb Raiders, that he looked at Lara Croft and it was just the chess piece, and I thought that was absurd. To try to take away all of the cultural references. So what was I trying to do? So what I was trying to do was make the case that that this digital medium, which I had been working, I had a background in the 19th century, in the English novel, development of the English novel over multiple centuries. And when I looked at computation, when my students showed me Eliza and Zork in the 1980s, I said, this is the beginning of a new narrative form. And I found that extremely exciting. And I still feel that it is a privilege to live in a time, which is rare in human history, when a new medium for story making comes into our hands. And then I became excited by those prospects, and I was working in what would now be called serious games. We were making educational games for language learning and interactive documentaries, and a Shakespeare project. And that had multiple interpretations and multiple versions of folio and quarto versions that had different political connotations of Hamlet. All of that had strengthened my belief that that this was a medium like prose, like film, that is capable of expressing lasting, deeply resonant truths about the human experience, the way which is what we value about stories that we think of as lasting culture, as high culture. And so I picked the most dead, most white, male, most celebrated in Shakespeare, in his most celebrated play, and I said, well, could we combine that? And then what did the holodeck represent? Well, the holodeck represented a fantasy of everything that that digital representation might bring us. Suppose we put at the service of storytelling everything that digital representation could bring us. And of course, I was working at MIT, so I was closer to the vision of what we now take for granted. But those things that we now take for granted but were surprising to many people through the 2000s were already taken for granted around MIT, and there were instances of it. So you could see video conferencing, and you could see virtual reality, and you could see instances of artificial intelligence. And so it wasn't, and then there was an understanding of Moore's law. So of course, there was not an understanding of how impossible it would be to combine all these things for any particular instance. But there was the direction of change was clear. And I always say that it's easier to see the direction of change than the pace of change. So my orientation was to the direction of change. I was not interested in predicting what was going to happen next 6 months, what people were going to get rich from in the next decade. I was interested in over centuries, like with the development of the novel, how might this form evolve? And when I challenged myself to think about that, I had to say, well, if it is a new medium of representation, then what are its affordances that correspond to slicing up the film and moving the lens? And when I came up with that list of affordances, and then with the parallel list of, well, what are the pleasures, what are the aesthetics of this medium that are different from, although not a complete break with, but that are representative of this, of what we think we're going to get out of stories in this medium, then I came up with these 3 aesthetic principles as well. And once I had done that, I realized that these things were, they didn't only apply to stories. So I wrote another book, and of course this corresponded with my coming to Georgia Tech and having students who were interaction designers, that doesn't really talk about stories at all, but that talks about these affordances and these design goals as directing how you know if you've made a good one when you make anything out of bits. And I say that because that is really that underlies a lot of my deeper thinking about differences between games and interactive narrative. My interest is in any artifact that's made out of bits. We're always going to want to have the experience of agency in engaging it. And with games, we have a lot of mechanics for agency in a procedural environment. And so games, so in a way, we could think of anything made of bits as something like a game, just as the same way we could think of anything made of bits as potentially an archive project, because there's so much cheap capacity in anything that we make out of silicon. So that was my background. But then thinking about those affordances and those aesthetic values, I surveyed not just video games, but the legacy storytelling forms. And what I saw then has only been confirmed by the 20 years since then, which is that books are becoming more multi-sequential instead of unisequential. I don't like to use the word linear and non-linear, because as I tell my students, you can't design for a non-quality. You have to design for a particular quality. So I think that to have we're able to take in greater complexity in storytelling, in prose, in film, in TV, and I predicted those things, and from looking at the examples that were out there and then extrapolating and saying, well, television is probably going to be delivered in archive form from now on. So we're probably going to have these longer arcs. And then once you have the longer arcs, now we're seeing that people are, I would predict that the thing that we haven't yet done is people will want to navigate across those threads. They're not going to want to watch every bit of every episode when they go back into it. But we can keep in our minds all of those characters in Game of Thrones, but we don't really have the right interface for addressing that. So I looked at that, and then I looked at computer science explorations of procedural plot generation, which has also only increased in the past 20 years. And now AI characters are sitting on our phones and in our homes, and then also video games. So it was, and so when I thought about the holodeck, I wasn't thinking, this is the future of video game. I was thinking, this is a way in which all of these expressive possibilities could, if they, in fantasy, if they could all be maximized for storytelling, what would it look like? And this holodeck is the shorthand for that set of possibilities. And it's a shorthand as well for a very deeply held fantasy of perfect interactivity and immersion. So we would just walk into the room, be surrounded by characters. They would respond to us. Everything that we touched or saw would reinforce our sense that we were in that world. And then everything that we did would, and then we would get the experience that I call active creation of belief. So we would, by being in the world, we'd be scripted to want to do certain things, and every time we did something and it was rewarded by the way the environment was scripted perfectly to understand us and respond to us, we would, that would reinforce our immersion, which would then reinforce our desire to do things that would give us the experience of agency. So the holodeck is the model for that experience, that desire. And it's just a shorthand for saying, if all these promises of representational powers out of bits come true, then what would that give us to make stories out of? And now, 20 years later, some of those things seem closer than ever. So and so I've been going for the past year to a lot of, I guess 2 years, to a lot of VR conferences. And one of them, Gene Dolgoff, was there, who's the guy who actually told Gene Roddenberry, who invented the holodeck for the Star Trek series, about holography technology. But Dolgoff was drawn to it from this, to me, delusional sense that it was the ultimate way of reproducing reality. So he really believed that you could finesse the laws of physics and get a palpable imaginary world in which to dwell. And he described it with such passion to Roddenberry that he incorporated it in the relaunching of the Star Trek franchise in the form of this room that became the holodeck. And the thing that Roddenberry's vision added was that it was genre fiction. Right? So it was fiction that already scripted you, which has proven very productive for video games as well, because you know what you're supposed to do, and so you don't thrash around when a troll tells you that the dragon's in that direction. You think, oh no, probably the other direction. So you know what's at stake in an environment. So and here is a gangster fantasy with the characters from the holodeck, but it was always a very detailed world and a very responsive world. But when you think about it, it's made from a television series where they have a lot of technology for making sets and where they are scripting everything in a unilinear way. So, so to take it as a realizable vision takes a lot more suspension of belief than to take it as this exciting fantasy. And yet, people who, computer scientists will just say to you, and they've been doing this, you know, from before I wrote the book, and definitely since, this is the Holy Grail. This is what we want to do, is a holodeck. The other thing about the holodeck that's interesting is that it incorporated our fears about it. So if my subject is who's afraid of the holodeck, the creators of the holodeck incorporated this sense that there were always these violent things were going to happen. And either the imaginary character gets out, or you get stuck inside of the imaginary world, or the computer doesn't respond, which is very easy to believe. And there's one episode called Ship in a Bottle, where it's from the Sherlock Holmes story. Moriarty gets out, and then he's in the ship. No, he's not really in the ship. Actually, the crew is imprisoned in the simulation. No, actually, the problem is we can't get access to the computer to stop it. You know, so all of these fears that are fears of being overrun by our own imagination and of giving in to destructive impulses of the imagination, and also of surrendering, which sort of maps onto the surrendering to the machine, which is out of our control. They were all part of the presentation. And I think that it's driven by our underlying unease at representation itself. That the power of imaginative experience is scary to us. And you know, we know in design about the uncanny valley, where you draw something that is too much like a person but not a person, and that you have to, and then people are freaked out. Like in, what's the name of that Tom Hanks train movie? I'm sorry. Polar Express, yeah, right. Yeah, just look at any 2 seconds of it, and the uncanny valley completely clear to you. So you have to know where the boundary is. You have to know what the conventions are. And any new technology of representation is spooky because we haven't domesticated it yet. We don't know what the boundaries are. What if, when we say the name of God, he actually appears? That is a fear of oral communication. What if we write it, and if we spell it out completely, that may be bad, that may be taboo. How much power does it have to actually write down something from that other world? It might come, and we might be overwhelmed by it. So it's the holodeck represents this lasting fear, and I talk about this, and I won't go through this now, but I think that if I just looking at this list, I hope it's familiar to you that it's a recurring theme of human culture, that technology comes into our hands and it freaks us out. So here is this so the power of the holodeck. So the freak out and the attraction are evidence of the same thing. It's of some core desire that we have, that somehow there's a match between our hopes and fears and the ability to live in a purely imaginary world. And engineers have a tendency to take this literally. So one example of this in the 2000s was the ICT research lab in California, which was military and Hollywood and universities. Like, what could possibly go wrong, right? So, and I saw this, so I was immediately excited by it because they did Westerns, and I grew up in an era in which that was the major form of cultural fantasy, and that children were initiated into. And so you walk, and so they built an actual saloon set, and you go in those swinging doors, and then there were big screens, and it was mostly about the artificial intelligence. So they really thought that they could capture what people said and respond to it. So this was the optimistic view of it, that if we just had to throw enough computing power at it, we can do this, right? And then we'll throw in a little of the standard Hollywood magic. Okay. The dystopian version of it is Westworld, which was already a movie when Gene Doloff was pitching to Gene Roddenberry. But it was a very popular television series in the past year, as artificial intelligence characters have come to inhabit our domestic space. But again, the premise of it is that people would, someone would make $1 million if they could only make robots that would let you do whatever you want in this fantasy American West frontier environment. So I actually visited the one at ICT, and you see that it looks much less exciting with me in the middle of it. And it was much less exciting because there was not a clear enough interaction design. So what a situation like that does is it raises your level, especially whenever you use natural language, it raises your level of expectation much too high, and then you're definitely going to fail. And then there were a lot of gendered things and stuff that they were doing that annoyed me. But what worked, of course, was shooting at the bad guy. Which you could do in a penny arcade, you know, when I was 7 years old, with equal pleasure, I would say. So the fears are disproportionate to our ability to actually instantiate this. But we continue, and to our desire to have it. But we continue now with haptic technology. These are just two easily available examples that I picked off of Google. But I heard it a lot. I've seen many more of them. One with haptic, and then lots of them with VR, room scale VR. The holodeck is here. So that is just like writing games are better without stories, writing the holodeck is here. These are very good headlines for getting clicks. Right? And there are a lot of people who are trying to make money in the short run, who are, and other people who are just naive and excited by the novelty, who would say the same thing, you know, putting on a VR headset, you're there, right? That's all it takes. There's the holodeck. So, and it's because there's this wish for this immersive And at the same time, this has generated a culture of people being unduly panicking about it. So I'm at conferences, and people are very solemnly saying that this is going to be terrible because people are not going to be able to tell the real from the unreal. So it's exactly like television and comic books and everything else. And it's going to be addictive and it's escapist. It's so wonderful. And then somebody actually gave a paper saying that we better start regulating it because this is going to be an instrument of torture. So I said, well, you know how much easier it is to hurt a human being without having this stuff that breaks, and to hurt them in their actual body and not in some, picture that you put in their bed. It's so, all of these were, they were well-meaning, but they come out of the sense that there's something about these powers of representation that are just too much for us, and that we either have to have them right away and then, we'll be transported, or we are doomed by their existence. When actually the truth is so much more plotting, that they're just hard to make. And it takes a lot of iteration to make anything work at all, and particularly to design it for interaction. So that when you have a person in a new representational environment, you don't have any of the conventions of the over-the-shoulder camera, the separation into paragraphs, the point of view indication by who's narrating it. Everything that you know about how to get people to not notice the artifacts and just concentrate on the experience is gone. All you have is the sensory. And the sensory is just novelty, and it gets old really fast. And I'm not sure whether I guess I'm sort of slow. I think I will just continue with my presentation, but if there's time in the question period, and I certainly invite people to look at this. There are several examples of what my students did this year. With just student resources in making VR experiences. And I just want to talk about, and they're on this website that I have indicated there. But I want to say how much are we there and how much are we not there. So my experience. So I think that when we have the hand controllers, and our hands are there, and you have the room scale, so you can walk around at like a space about a quarter of this room. Then you are much more present than when you have just 360 headset, and the only way to look at it is in a swivel chair at a desk. I mean, and then you don't know really why you should be turning, or so this is much more present. You can set up, as my students did with technology, that they got from ICT. These impossible spaces. So you could make what seems like a much bigger space. So in the project, the Ares project, you go through caves that are supposed to be on Mars. And you can pick things up, you can swing an axe, and that's very satisfying. You can see people on the videos when they go through a narrow space, they really think that it's narrow. When there was a gap in the floor, I actually, and I was familiar with how it was made, had to have my student hold my, I had to hold on to him to remind myself that I wasn't really there, because it was so wired into us. This is a familiar reaction that's well known, that you can't really step over what you think is a fall. But you really, when I was in an elevator, we had a flaw in it, and had gone down a level in an elevator, and when he started it up again, I thought, oh, you'll have to take me up in the elevator, because in my mind I was actually there, even though I knew I was in my lab, and he just had to start it at the right point in the experience. So you do have a sense of being there. It is very physicalized. But you also are totally aware that it is a picture, that you can put your hands right through, that you can't really touch and feel the weight of things, and that it's navigable, so it's intriguing, and we know how to walk around, so that's a great, simple interface, but there isn't enough of a boundary to feel that you're immersed, because you don't know what to do. So that actually people feel more in the experience when after they fall and on a tightrope thing, and then they can walk. Or when I touched my student, because then you can suspend disbelief. Then oh yeah, I'm just pretending. But you have to sort of physicalize that in some way. So you really need a door. And the door is not just a knowing that where the space ends. It's also not trying to reproduce reality exactly. So that as a documentary filmmaker, the documentary films that just put you with a 360 camera in the middle of an experience are not as immersive as Noni de la Peña's very crafted experiences, where she has selected one dramatic moment from an actual experience, and where the sound is real, but the people are obviously computer generated. So then you can relax. This is one about a homosexual teenager coming out to his very violently unaccepted. He's not coming out. He's fighting. He's about to leave the home of these abusive step-parents and parents. Okay, so there really is an appetite for these immersive fictional experiences, and it goes way beyond video games. So are people familiar with Punch-Drunk Theater? There they use the mask to set up the boundary. And there's a lot that one could do to make that a much more satisfying narrative experience. It's a successful spectacle experience, but it doesn't make your choices of dramatic agency, because the things that are happening simultaneously, it's not clear why you should go one way or another. People have an appetite for playing role-playing games in these richly detailed worlds. So like Walking Dead, like Game of Thrones, both of those have had very successful transmedia games associated with them, made by Telltale Games, which have specialized in fiction, and which people might think of as very unsatisfying in their game mechanics in some way, but very satisfying in their fictional immersion. There are many examples of successful narratively driven games where your motivation for doing things comes out of the narrative. And in particular, there's a whole tradition that goes back to the very beginning of video games, of these house exploring games, which is now being used again for the story of a gay teenager, a young woman, that is buried in artifacts within this house in Gone Home. And I think this is a strategy that is going to be very productive for virtual reality, is to make the space, to embed the space with storytelling elements that you discover, and to put red herrings, like in Gone Home, there's red hair dye that is actually a red herring. It's not blood, it's just hair dye. So making the space tell the story, I think is very promising. So one of the reasons why people are object to games and stories is because they're often not well knit together. But when they are knit together, then you can find this reinforcement, so that the game mechanic, like unlocking a space, maps onto the narrative curiosity. In order to find out what happens next, you have to put these narrative pieces together. And one of the things I've seen in these 20 years is that those games used to be rather arbitrary, but now they're much more story-driven in the tasks that you're asked to do. But it's not only games that are enriching that palette. There is an impetus to tell interactive stories on their own, for which games are just a part of the expressive palette. And because games have been so well developed for interactivity, they're available. But the desire is, even though we might call it a video game, though we might distribute it through video games, it's actually about storytelling. So it belongs to this other constellation, and it can belong to both. It's not either or. But the impetus is to storytelling, and that there's a wider palette of expressive elements available, some of which are games and some of which are not. You can ask me about gnomes and goblins, and I'll tell you why it's adorable. So the holodeck is a summary concept for this urge to create interactive, immersive narratives. And it is its own tradition of practice, as Hartmut will tell you eloquently. And it is, using his term IDN, it's one of the narrative traditions. And when these things work well, game mechanics and story mechanics, they reinforce each other. And Clara Fernandez-Vara, who's at NYU, and is another one of my students, coincidentally, on this slide, has talked about adventure games in this way, about how the story drives the mechanics, and the mechanics abstract the story. So digital narrative draws on these video games conventions, but it draws on them with other design elements as well. And that is what we need in order to reach this. This is my holy grail, is to have greater, and it's a process, not one achievement. How do we have greater and greater human expressivity in this form? We draw from all these palettes. So why are some game studies folks so upset about this? So I did write this essay about it in 2006, but since then I read this book by Natasha Schul about machine gambling in Las Vegas, and I think that offers another clue. Because just as the holodeck is a seductive goal for people and a scary goal, so too is just the immersion in gambling for its own sake. And there is a whole industry which she studies, which is the dark side of the force of game design, which its goal is to keep a player at a machine until the term for it is extinction. This is the industry term for it, meaning they have maxed out every bit of money you could get out of them. It's really evil. But what she also, as in an anthropological way, interviewed the players. And the players will say that they get annoyed when they win because you have to go and get the money out of the thing. And what they want to do is they want to keep manipulating those abstract symbols. So you keep people focused on a set of abstract symbols that, and it never ends. And this is, of course, why Candy Crunch or Tetris or any of these games are appealing, and we say, oh, I'm addicted to it, because there's a joy and then there's a danger in it. And I think, and so when they're in that state, it's the zone. And I think that that state is the exact opposite of storytelling. And I think that the Gamergate anxieties are also on this spectrum. That if you're going into that world as a world in which representation is absent, where you can only manipulate the symbols, and this is one of the things games historically have done for us, is increase literacy by giving us facility with symbol systems. But if the symbols do not relate at all to the world, then they're no longer meaningful signifier. Then you are really upset if someone tries to pull you back into symbols as signifiers. And because it is bringing you from a state outside of time. You know, the gamblers lose all sense of time. They don't know how long they've been doing it. And stories are being captured in time. They're about cause and effect and consequences. And compelling stories that we savor and repeat and that become part of our moral character and our souls, they make us reflect on our own choices and our own imprisonment in time, and they compensate us for the inevitable losses of time. But the gaming machine is the opposite of that. Now, it's not as if that desire to manipulate symbols is bad in itself, because that underlies our joy in shared attention and in sharing our sense of pattern matching and in creating rituals. But it's opposed in some way. I mean, it can reinforce, but it can oppose the other side of the spectrum, which is the need to interpret the world, to feel, to understand cause and effect, to be engaged emotionally and morally, and to look at imaginative experience as reflective of our and challenging our cultural values. So I just closing, want to reiterate that Hamlet on the Holodeck was never only about video games. It was about the future of narrative, and I remain very optimistic about that future and grateful to be alive in a moment of human history when a new medium comes into our hands for the very ancient practice of collective meaning-making through stories. There's no doubt in my mind that we need the widest, deepest possible palette drawn from games and theater and television and oral culture and films and anything else we can get our hands on to take advantage of the unique affordances of this medium to do what stories have always done, to deepen our individual and collective understanding of what it means to be human, and to share our experiences and values so that we can broaden the circle of recognition and compassion and learn how to better care for one another. Thank you. Only 5 minutes anyway. So we'll take some questions, and then there's alcohol waiting or something, right? So we could also have more questions over refreshments. Refreshment. Everybody totally agrees with me, so yeah.
Hey, Rene Glas. I studied 2D animation at HKU, and I was wondering if you had any experience with 2D animation in a narrative in interactive storytelling, and if you could say something about the advantages or disadvantages.
Oh, well, I mean, I've seen wonderful examples of it, but can I bring any to mind?
Do you think
I think it's fine.
brings something extra to interactive?
I think yes, I think that what it brings is there's an expressive palette that we recognize. So if you put like a cat on a screen in 2D, and it's a cartoon cat, then it's going to do things that are going to be much more readable than my grandcat, for instance, my son's cat, or than a cat that's made from the most subtle AI, where it won't be abstracted enough. Any mature form of representation is an abstraction system. So that is one of the advantages, it's part of the palette. The trick is to make it multi-sequential, not unisequential. So you can use those same expressive elements, but in a story that makes sense in multiple ways. It's more complex.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You focus a lot on video games, and especially the digital side of games, but I wondered why specifically you just look at the digital games, even though things like physical games, board games, and
Yeah.
actual role-playing games are actually quite similar to things that VR do or digital games.
I did in the book, I do talk a lot about role-playing, live-action role-playing games, LARPing. And I'm glad you bring that up. And it should have been on my slide, like role-playing games, definitely. And board games. There's a lot. I was referencing a mechanic from a board game just yesterday when I was giving somebody advice, probably unsolicited advice about how to do something they were designing. Yeah, I think, and games are a very ancient form of abstraction. So I'm glad you mentioned them. Yeah.
So you talked about your experience at ICT, and you said, okay, so my expectations were too high, or at least they were built up too high, and the natural language interaction didn't work well enough, basically, to meet them. So, but of course, in stories, language is really important. So, would you advocate just, I don't know, doing things like what is done in video games, where you just have to choose from a menu or something?
So
it's also limiting your agency, right?
Well,
I guess that was the goal.
is it so?
Say what they like.
It's a very good question. So I had this argument a lot with Michael Matthias over Facade. I don't know if people are familiar with that. So I think that is a virtuoso achievement in story generation. I think that they did not do a successful interaction design. and that a more successful interaction design might have had less computation. So often, and I believe that if you have a set of values, design values, for any digital artifact, agency is the reigning value. Agency is the most important. So if you're making something, then if you're starting with the interaction design, then a menu-driven schema can be much more effective. And actually, there was a very good, but you could also have both. There was one that it's unfortunately not available except on a old operating system of iPad, but Emily Short did a story called Blood and Laurels, which I think is a wonderful achievement it has a lot of multi-sequential paths and a lot of complexity, but you always know what your choices are. And actually, as I'm reminding myself of that one, the parts that were most computationally ambitious did not work successfully. Yeah. So, yeah. So you just have to be clear what your success criteria are. If you're a computer scientist, then and you want to generate story, that's great. But you should be clear about it. Yeah.
Thank you, Jenny, for this inspiring talk. I really enjoyed it. What are your thoughts on augmented reality? Because that's also a new form where this whole storytelling can explode.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Yeah, I think that's more promising in the short run than. I mean, I like working with virtual reality because it's like there's no. It's a Wild West. There's just nothing domesticated about it. But for and the augmented reality, there isn't really a good consumer level platform yet. But I think that it is so captivating to see things. You're in your familiar space, and then the wall starts to crack, and things come out of your wall, or you're looking at your coffee table, and cute little beings are running around. So I think that is extremely promising. But again, it's not. We have to develop a set of interactions, and they have to match the platform, and the platform doesn't track your hands well enough. So if it could track your hands, it would be I think that might be the turning point. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this lecture. It's very inspirational. You've talked a lot about the immersive possibilities of digital media and stories that aim to erase sort of our awareness of technology. However, there's also a lot of stories being told where the user has to actively choose to start a video to continue the story or to even move to a different platform. What are your views on the possibilities of those stories?
Where you're in a interactive environment, but then parts of the story are in a video within the story. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, for example, or if it's even like a cross-media story where part of the story is on the website, the other on a Twitter account.
So I think anything that gives you a reason to actively take the next step is good. But I think that you have to structure those moments. They have to be really clearly authored. It can't be just, you can't just say, oh, people will just explore. You have to have a reason and an idea in mind. If I look at this, it's going to tell me who did the murder, or it'll tell me, and then you have to reward that, but with some surprise, and you have to do it in a brief amount of time. So yeah, I think that the transmedia structures are appealing. To me, I'm always looking too far over the horizon, perhaps. I would like to see like an environment that integrates us, but and I haven't seen that many examples of really well synchronized transmedia. But yeah, I think that there's a definite. I think those are productive areas to explore. Yeah.
I was curious, what are your thoughts on the future of effective computing in relation to immersive?
Affective computing?
Yes.
Where it understands your emotions and...
Yeah, the one that reads your psychophysiology and
Yeah.
interprets the future.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical.
Really?
Yeah, I find it reductive, and I'm very skeptical of that.
And what about using other senses than just vision? Like,
Oh, yeah, you sweat or something? Yeah.
No,
I'm as skeptical.
No, but I was asking about maybe the olfactory and what is the future of that? That's not gonna happen.
It doesn't seem so as promising to me. It might happen. Anybody might put money into anything, but I don't think it's. I'm not optimistic about the results, and I'm skeptical of the people who claim to have results.
Is there a particular reason?
Because I think human emotions are very complicated, and I think that so I think it's unlikely that they can be read from the strategies that I've seen described. And I also, don't even get me started on the one reading the brain. That one, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, hello. I would like to ask you, because you mentioned punch drunk.
Yeah.
Sort of an immersive, like the desire to be immersive, like in terms of theater.
Yes.
Sort of practice. And I was wondering if you know the work of Glas theory. Have you ever heard?
Possible. Tell me.
It's a theater-based company based in Brighton.
Oh.
And they do like interaction with audience, but using games and technology.
Yeah. Yes.
And that
Yes.
makes sense.
Yeah, and they're very leftist. They're political, right?
Yeah, sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen their work in a while. I mean, I remember liking their work.
Do you use like a period to develop like maybe a new game? So they work like a lot on the project and they really think in terms of structure or whatever you were saying in terms of developing like new narrative using games. My question would be, knowing the Glass theory approach, how you would compare that with Punch Drunk? Which is sometimes it's like, I mean, I
Yeah.
work, and yeah, I would like to know where
Well, so the last thing I saw from Blast Theory probably was 10 years ago or something. So I don't know what they're up to lately. And Punch Drunk, I did experience the London production, Drowned Man, and I know people who went to the New York production and liked it better than I liked the London production. But I think that it's successful as spectacle. People do seem to enjoy it. I think that the idea of the mask is very good, and it is one of the strategies that I talk about in chapter 4. Actually, for immersion, is that a mask is a way of establishing a boundary. It's a fourth wall. So they're very clever about that, and they're the right masks. But I don't think, they don't use words a lot. They're really a dance troupe. So, and I'm very much admire them for getting a lot of people to come and watch dance. I think that's great. But I don't think that the story is well segmented, and that and I don't think, what the problem, what I would like to see in something like that, I like the idea of promenade theater, and a lot of, I've heard reports of others, but that might have worked better in some ways. For my taste, I would like to know why I'm following that character and not the other character. And people who come to those stage sets that they build with an expectation from video games are disappointed because they're not, they're too randomly assembled.
Structure and like multiple way of interact with something, because you really need a structure to do to explore really what that means, instead of just create an entertaining.
Yeah, so I would say that navigation can be an experience of dramatic agency. You don't have to change the story to experience dramatic agency. If you have a reason to discover something and you're excited to do it, then that's great. But if you're just going from one spectacle to the next, that can be a successful entertainment. And it could be the beginning of a platform. Other people. I mean, maybe this kind of spectacle entertainment is good, and it goes with bars and there's always a place to dance and to drink and stuff. So it's a different kind of an experience. And play act. People feel like they've been role playing without much at stake. So that might be a form in itself, but it might also develop into something that is has more complex story structure, where you would really discover something about a situation that you were invested in, and you'd come out with a changed perspective from comparing with another person what they had done by sympathetically following a different character. I think that kind of story is the kind of story we desperately need. So I'm impatient for it.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
There's one more?
We'll make that the last, and then I'll take more questions over refreshments. How's that?
Starting your presentation with the debate between ludologists and narratology, I was wondering, from my own experience of coming from a design academy background, I see that storytelling has become like this term everybody uses on everything.
I know. I know. Yes, and I could say a lot about the very loose use of the word storytelling. I think one thing that is promising is the speculative fictions, but I'm always more interested in people who make things that people use. But sometimes the speculative fiction can really surface values, and it's a way of wedding design to practices more like science fiction and cultural critique. So I'm becoming increasingly aware of those practices, and I'll tell you one place in which I think it terribly misused is in information visualization. People describe things as storytelling, meaning they have 2 slides instead of 1 or something. I mean, that's not that much of a caricature. That's about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.